Welcome back to Tech, Tesla, and Trends. Tonight, I'm looking at the publish or perish culture of academia and how it is corrupting the overall process and progress of science and the trend that it has become in our world today. The reason this is important is we see how science is a critical component to progress and technologies. The problem being when we have assumptions that are not able to be questioned because they are a favorite notion or theory or idea of those in the academic journal community. I was listening to two professors from, I believe they were Stanford, and they were discussing how one of this professor's articles would never be published today because he had discovered his discovery invalidated a popular idea of his time. This is a problem. And the reason it's a problem is there are assumptions that are made within classrooms and within our own minds about what we know and what we think we know. And if we cannot ask questions to invalidate or examine the data that is surrounding the decisions that we've made, the papers that we write, then we have at the core a very perplexing problem if we are seeking to identify truth and principles that have lasting value to humanity. So as we look at this publish or perish concept, usually universities are making a bet on which professors are going to be able to achieve tenure. And this is, pretty much if you don't publish, you're not getting your tenure. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure that within 5 years' time that you will have published something of value. And unfortunately, there's a number of articles now that are coming out identifying, and this isn't new, this is over the last decade easily, and closer to 2, there are reports of at least a third of articles in journals that are either fraudulent or plagiarized. Heavily plagiarized. And, while that may work to get yourself elected to the President of the United States, that is not something that is going to work for the future good of humanity when it comes to scientific principles. Because we have to be able to evaluate the data and look at it from a perspective of how does it actually stack up against reality. And this integrity matter is very important for the growth of science and technology. And as we look at it, it's one of those core principles that we assume about science, that there is integrity involved in the process, that the scientific method is testing and that you can falsify some of the results if it isn't true. If you have an idea that can't be falsified because it can't be questioned, or it won't be allowed to be questioned by the journals, that's a whole different conversation, and one that is definitely a trend within the scientific community. There's documentation down below in the notes. You can go through those. The journals, NIH, and a whole bunch of others that have been discussing this. At the core of it, though, it's really important to understand this publish or perish culture, that it pervades everything. That pressure to gain tenure causes some to crack. And if the numbers appear to be about a third of what we're seeing is questionable. So what are those negative consequences for that? Well, obviously there's misconduct in that. As we see, there's scientific fraud, and we've had some pretty huge scandals over the years. Companies that were valued into the billions, and then all of a sudden, oh, yeah, our blood thingy didn't work actually. That is a huge red flag that we've seen in the past. And if we take a look at how this plays out long term, it isn't just at the university level either. It's the corporate, obviously, is part of it as well. I remember years ago with the whole publishing of an article about cold fusion, and two professors that claimed they had done so, and then they're gone. Their research was able to be invalidated. Though what I found comical was initially there were some that were trying to say, "Oh yeah, maybe it can be done." This is part of the problem. They don't want to miss out, and therefore they will sometimes jump on the train. And if that happens, then that idea becomes ensconced into the ideas of things that can't be questioned. And that leads to dogmas within science that are dangerous to the overall progress of our scientific world. Now, it's important that we question the process, because this is part of science. If you can't examine the data and you can't examine the processes that the scientists walked through, then you have no way of knowing whether the claims of their articles have any validity. This is especially true with things like what some of the pharmaceutical companies have been claiming in recent years. They claim they own the data. Well, if you own the data and nobody else can look at it, and you write the report, there's a serious question of ethics here. Especially if you write the report and have a doctor sign it, because you're paying for their research grant. That is really at the ethical edge. And this is something that there are documented cases of that. We have to consider the true nature of what is being undermined in this whole process. And it really comes down to, are we going to have truth coming out of these research efforts, or are we going to just have giant boondoggles where we waste billions of dollars on things that have no meaning? This appears to be the case, by the way, when you look at some of the billions that have been spent on studies of certain types of basket weaving and other things like that. And then there's also the promiscuity that aspect of some of those studies that is completely not necessary. And it gets down to the overall vanity and also corrupted mind of some of these research grants. So then it gets down to the question of how these are published. If we look at the publishing aspect of that, some of these journals have very clear guidelines, and some of them do not. Some of them are, you must pay us for the ability to be published, and others are, well, if you want a copy of it, we're going to charge you for it. Oh, and by the way, you better be a member too. This appears legit, and yet there is an aspect of pay to play involved in this particular process. As papers are submitted, there needs to be a clearinghouse of some sort for the data that is being submitted for these papers. And the journals, yes, there's a need for specialized journals. I get that particular aspect of the conversation. But the trouble is when these journals are specifically funded by organizations that have a vested interest. So the moment we allowed research to be paid for by corporations, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was an unintended consequence, that we lost control of science in the 80s. And it's gone downhill ever since. And this is truly one of the concerns that I see currently in our scientific world, is the integrity of the scientific process. Because it's not always a matter of truth ruling out. Oftentimes what we are seeing is that if you are an influential member of society, you can somehow get the concerns of the papers you've written brushed aside. And this is truly one of those concerns that I'm definitely worried about when we look at, everything that went on with COVID and some of the concerns that were going on there, some of the research that has been done, and some of the denials that have been published and then retracted. It really is a concern that we must consider. The integrity of science is at stake, and I truly believe we have to improve the process for how we examine the research of science. And as we look at the ethical concerns that are involved in that, it erodes the ability for us to believe in the intellectual integrity, in the educational processes that are associated with those research grants. And it also, if we are engaged in what may appear on the outside as quid pro quo for journal entries and then a job later on within that company, these sorts of things look suspicious when you look backwards at some of the careers and the papers that led to where people are and their association with larger companies and the funded research. Now, there's an argument to be made that it was good quality research and they're just hiring quality people. There is definitely cases of that. I am not saying that that's every case, that there's corruption at that level. I am saying that there are instances that, as we've looked through, all you have to do is watch the news over any given year, and you will find examples of corruption that has occurred within corporations and within their research processes. Some of it's big news, and others is just minor bylines in the business journals. But this is part of the ethical concerns that we have. And this is a trend that is really one that it scares me, I'll be honest. But looking forward, how do we solve this? Because that's really the question that is before us. How do we solve this? I think that the promotion of transparency in that article process is paramount. That we need good quality review processes that enable peer review, that enable collaboration, that enable that open data set for your results to be analyzed. And that includes all of these big pharma folks claiming that their data is proprietary. That may be. But if it is, your results can't be analyzed. And as such, whatever it is you're claiming to put on the market as scientifically reviewed, it's not. It can't be. There's no possibility of it because only your corporate approved individuals have looked at it. And that is not science. That's not a review process. That is an internal review. That is a huge red flag to me. Every time I see an advertisement on TV for a pharmaceutical product, I question it anymore because I am positive that they are seeking to use their power of advertisement to get to the mind rather than truly allowing the data to speak for itself. That you have to push the product in order to justify its existence and get your money returned for the research invested. It's a concern with the way that we currently advertise. And yeah, I mean, obviously it's important because it appears to have cost Tucker Carlson his job because he dared to question some of the practices of the major advertisers. And that's one of those concerns. I mean, videos like this, it'll never be monetized. That's just the nature of the game. But overall, we have to think about these things and revisit how this process works. Because if we're not discussing how that evaluation process can be improved, then I don't believe that we have any opportunity to change this system to where we have clear metrics that can identify that, yes, this particular journal article has been evaluated. It has had the proper reviews so that we know there's credibility here. There is statistical evidence here. And as we look at this, understanding that the criticality of review in this whole scientific process is it's one of those foundational points. The research is important, but validation of the data gives us the ability to trust that research and to build upon that research even further. Now, cultivating that culture of collaboration and of ethics, that's going to be a challenge because, yes, there's a lot of people discussing how this is ethically challenging and the problems with the publish or perish culture. Everybody's willing to say, oh, it's a horrible system, but we don't know how we're going to make it better. It's got to have some serious thought put into it. And there is definitely a method, at least online, if we choose to create some more transparent processes. If nothing else, having data, being able to post it on Twitter, for crying out loud. The public commentary notes, those are pretty good. I think that you would find that even a similar process applied to scientific journals would be shocking at a minimum. And the commentary, well, you might get a little bit of the natural scientific one-upmanship. I think that you would find that there is a better review process, even with that simple of a solution in place, rather than the current pay-to-play mentality that exists. What's the solution long-term? Your guess is as good as mine. Those are some of my ideas, some of the thoughts that I have on it. Ultimately, there are some serious negative impacts currently on science because of this publish or perish mentality. There's documented fraud that occurs. There's documented fraud that's been moved up the chain from research into company status. Theranos is just one example. There's plenty others. And, it's important that collectively we work to address this problem, to restore the integrity of the scientific process. And it's not going to be an easy one. It's an ensconced, broken system. It has its defenders on the wall. And those of us that are interested parties just on the sidelines looking in, going, yeah, that doesn't look so ethically clear. You're dealing in muddy water there. We're ignored. And I get it. Nobody likes to hear from the outsider. But in this case, at least a third of the people pretending to be emperors have no clothes. And that's, while that may be acceptable in some parades, it's not acceptable in the scientific world. Not if you're truly trying to advance the cause of science. So it's been a long one here. I encourage you to leave some comments tonight, and we can carry on the conversation. If you've got ideas, feel free to share them. I'm sure that many of you will have some good ideas, and I'm sure some of you object to some of the very comments I've made. And that's all right. Let's have a conversation below. So have a good night, and be sure to like and subscribe if you care to carry on this conversation some more, and share with your friends. Because heaven knows, Google's not going to monetize this one. Have a good night.